Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Deep Dive December series here at Impact Marathon. My name is Nick Kershaw. I'm the founder and CEO of the Impact Marathon series, and I'm really thrilled to be sharing with you something that we've been working on for the past couple of months. We wanted to offer you an opportunity at the end of the year to pause and think about how we create the world we dreamt we lived in as kids. And so we looked at how we've been structuring everything and how do we work out how to set up an impact week? How do we work out what are the best projects? And the fact is that most of the great ideas we've had have happened whilst having a coffee, a beer, whiskey, and learning and listening to the local partner charities and operators and all of the different stakeholders involved in the impact week. And those conversations, they can't just be offered up in a 2-minute trailer. They can't even be put forward in a way that looks great on a presentation. The fact is that they happen without time limits. They happen with us just having those conversations, learning and listening. And we wanted to just do that again and show you a little bit more about the level of conversation that we have when we're trying to work out how to create an impact week. So first up, we are talking with Sara Hurtarte, who is the co-executive director of Saras, our partner organization in Guatemala. Saras is inspiring for so many different reasons, but in the conversation today, we talk about an all-female leadership team. We talk around the role of Indigenous women within that leadership team as well. We talked about the Fuego volcano eruption of June 2018, as Saras was right in the center of that. We talked about everything. We thought we would end up talking about Formula One because we both love it, but that's not quite the case. We pretended there was a fire beside us. We brewed up a couple of teas and we chatted away. And really, what's amazing about this conversation that I think is so helpful and useful for people to hear is that even for me, having worked on this race for 4 years, there was things that she said where suddenly it's like, ha! The penny just dropped. I see that connection now. I see how that works. And I can look at things differently. And already we've got new ideas for the partnership going forward. So we were pretending we were sat by the fire having a brew. I suggest you do the same and enjoy this deep dive. So, Sara, awesome to have you here talking to us about the work of Saras and about Guatemala. And I guess the best place to start in all of this is really focusing on your story. How did you end up working at Saras, and what was your story to get into the impact and charity sector?
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for having me. So excited for fireside conversation. Well, I started when I was 18 years old. I was in university. I think I was living in my own world and wasn't very connected to the realities that we were living in the country. And as part of a university project, we formed a group of friends and partnered with an NGO that is currently located near the city dumpster. And we volunteered for, I think, Christmas wrapping presents for their kids at the school. And from them, I think a project came to mind of how can we support women, the mothers of the children attending their school. And I think that's when I first started really getting involved. We supported them with a small project on teaching how to make jewelry from recycled materials and start making some own income because they were working as garbage collectors. So they were like separating garbage. That was their main job. And on the side, they were taking some classes because most of them didn't attend primary school. So they weren't educated. And I think that's where my interest and my shift to, creating impact just started. We worked with them for about 3 years. Of course, I continued to study in university and my major was business administration. And I was like, what can I do with this instead of just benefiting myself? So that was a big shift on, how I saw, my career and, what I wanted to do professionally. So after graduating, I had the opportunity to start working in some government projects focused on youth. I started getting involved with other group of youth in some like youth topics that were interesting at the time. And I was a coordinator of a national program for recreational workshops during the weekends for vulnerable youth on different parts of the country. This was a really big project, and one of the things I did notice back then was, okay, some of the skills that I had as the leader, and then some of the ones that I lack as well. So that was like, how do I see impact from a more of a public policy perspective? And that was when my interest in continuing my studies. So I had the opportunity to apply for a scholarship, went abroad, studied in Australia for about 2 years. And then when I came back, I was like, okay, what's my next big step? I was very intrigued about, what were the issues affecting youth at the time. I did a small case study on youth pregnancies as part of my master's program. And of course, I wanted to continue into that area. And I found Saras. I think it was, something that clicked. And they, had a very different view on youth programs. Instead of, having youth only as beneficiaries, they saw them as like the essential part of, of what they were doing. So that's when I joined in. I try to use all of my skills as a, business management and organizational skills and, all that. And then also my knowledge on public policies and social programs and projects into Saras. So that's when I joined in 2016.
And now you are the ED, the co-ED alongside Abby. And I guess the question that comes up there is you're in Australia at Carnegie Mellon, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And so you're studying the masters there. And I guess for a lot of the people who would watch this and listen to this, I think it's fair to say not the word Guatemala, the country Guatemala is not necessarily a country they necessarily could point in the map, let alone understand the history and the culture. So I guess in answering this question, it'd be great if you can give a little bit of a background to Guatemala for people who haven't, got much knowledge of the country, because it is an extraordinary place. What made you return? What made you want to go back to Guatemala and begin working again? Because you said you didn't really know what you were looking for projects when you returned, so it wasn't like you came back with so what made you come back from Australia and start working again on the future of Guatemala?
Australia was beautiful. It's a really nice country, and it was a very small town where I was studying in Adelaide, and then my scholarship was a government-sponsored scholarship. So one of the things and one of the commitments when accepting the scholarship was I'll do my time, my studies, and then my commitment was coming back to the country and using everything that I learned back to and implementing, something, getting involved in more of like creating impact for the country. So I think once I said yes at the beginning of my program was, I have in mind that I'm going back, and everything that I know, I'm just giving it back also, because they invested in me, So I think that was one of the things that was really clear for me. And it was really funny because every time I talked about Guatemala, they were like, look at me really strange with a face like, that's South America? And I'm like, no, it's Central America. So just making that distinction, it was really important for me because when you talk to someone from Australia, especially, they know more South America, and they, everything above Mexico, that's South America. And we're like, okay. So it was also something that helped me learn more about my country too. How do you explain to other people that don't know, and what's your country like, and what the conversation should be also. So Guatemala is a small country located in the southern part of Mexico, but it's part of Central America. And for me, it's a very diverse country. We have 23 different ethnic groups and languages. And that diversity also, creates its challenges. Our main source of income, you will say it's remittances. I think it's how it's called. From people that migrate outside of the country, especially to United States, and agriculture. We are one of the biggest exporters on agriculture in the region, especially to other Central American countries, to the United States, Mexico, and some other parts of probably Europe and Middle East, depending on the product. So I think that's basically what our economy looks like. But then we are, I think, a country with a lot of challenges. Around 46% of our population, especially children under 5 years old, suffer from malnutrition. And even though, we're a country of agriculture, and food is everywhere, it's available everywhere you go. So I think that disparity and that inequality is just
why do you think that is the case? How is it that you've become such a sort of focus on exports when there's such malnutrition in the country, and yet that abundance of food being grown?
I think it's complex. It's not only that we have an abundance of food, but it's also people that usually own those farms and have the opportunity and the businesses to export are not the people that are suffering the malnutrition, but more the richest people in the country. So the inequality between the poorest people and the richest people here, it's quite a big gap. And also the people that are on the poor end of our spectrum, they also lack education. So once you have a really young mother having a child with very few years of schooling, then that risk of malnutrition just deepens. And I think that's when you can see that in the country, that it's not only having a lot of food, but it's also how can you access health services, and how can you access also educational levels of schooling for mothers and fathers.
And then within, this seems like a really good time to talk about La Finca. And within Saras, you've got sort of the three programs. One of those programs is this extraordinary piece of land. I don't want to incorrectly quote it. I think it's something around the lines of 26 acres on the volcanic slopes. And just the story of this, obviously, has been a huge part of my time in Guatemala and the incredible place it is. And obviously there's a story to it socially, there's a story to it in terms of how Saras has used the land. But I'm particularly interested in honing in on the malnutrition element and the use of permaculture on the land. And permaculture has come up time and time again in the conversations I've had recently and ever since beginning the impact journey. What is it that made you want to use the land in that way, to focus in on permaculture, to work with the communities on that? What was the inspiration behind that?
And I think it comes back when we're talking about how are you connecting with your origins, and I think that's what permaculture offers, and then that's one of the ways that we saw it as well. So we wanted to go back to that wisdom and that knowledge that permaculture bring as a way of agriculture, but also connecting with and it was really interesting. We were having a tour with Marco Antonio and Aníbal, which they are the ones that are leading the finca. They're supervising it, they're planting, they're the ones, like, they're the masters of the finca, I would say. And we asked a question to Marco Antonio saying, like, how do you know that knowledge that trees communicate with each other, and plants, that are next to each other, they're communicating among themselves, and they're passing through information? And he was like, well, that's knowledge that my grandfather taught me, that's things that we've learned in the past. And that's also very ingrained when you're talking about permaculture. The association of crops is really important and the design of it. So I think one of the reasons why we wanted to bring that into, the land and the knowledge that we were using to cultivate and to share with others was, that approach and what that brought. And also because you're using what you already have. So you're not creating something that's not already there. So everything is taught from what the land can provide you. So I think that was also something that we wanted to harness even more, to learning more about design in terms of permaculture, and also sharing, what it offered, not only for the land, but also for the farmers that, didn't have that idea. And they'll probably know about that one, because they were taught, but not the technical terms. So that, I think that provided them with a framework of like, oh, that's really interesting. And I used to do it, and sort of bringing them back from the traditional agricultural farming that they learned, from a few years ago.
And so in your previous work with the government or the youth side of things, is it fair to say that permaculture wasn't something that came up as a solution to youth problems? And if that is the case, how is it that you've managed to blend this concept of origins, land use, nutrition, and connection with the earth into the work that Saras does with the youth?
Yeah, I would say that in my previous experiences, you wouldn't see this approach into the work that we were doing. I think it was mainly, using time wisely so that youth wouldn't get into, delinquency and gangs, and, weren't at the mercy of some of those groups in their communities, but not sort of focus into how can you create a vision with them, and what's the community vision, and how is that connected to, because I think that's also what some of the approaches that we use, not only at the land, but in a lot of things that we do, is how can you connect a vision of your community, and then how you feel that gap. And I think we didn't do that, or I wasn't, in the spaces that I was before. It's not something that you would normally see. So how, like, integrating that has been interesting for me personally, because I've also learned a lot from my colleagues, from the people that, the network that I have around myself and around Saras, to start navigating this sphere that, has grown with the time. I think Saras started with those concepts early in 2009. And that, was really strange to see that, not a lot of the programs that I was part on in 2012 were already talking about that, and Saras was already doing this work. So I wish I could have joined sooner to Saras if I had the opportunity, but, I came when the time was right, and I came to support how I could. So
what do you think the steps are towards taking these kind of concepts and making them part of that conversation from your previous work, and introducing them to policy and government? What needs to happen to change the policy system from trying to solve the problem and kind of cure it, rather than the sort of preventative elements that things like La Finca are able to offer?
I keep hearing a lot, and I think it's there that you need to listen, and you need to learn how to listen. But I think beyond just listening is how do you intentionally bring people, and not to the table, because I think that concept is rather really strange, but how do you as a policymaker come closer to the people and really listen and really sort of ask the questions, while working in some, like, reviewing policy papers, and some some of them are really well drafted and, have the technical knowledge, and you might consider, including a lot of, sustainable development goals into the mix. But then my question is always like, how does that policy gets implemented at the local level? What's lacking there? And for me, that's always the case where, they're probably well thought of and have, indicators and whatever, but I lack to see them, how do they grasp in the communities, how that policy gets an immediate impact for them. So I wish that, that could be more reflected into those policies. And I think that's could only be done by, of course, including insight, listening, what needs to be considered in order to be, for that policies to actually be taking into action and, actually be making change. So of course we try to do it all the way around, right? We start first with the community, we listen, we start taking action, and then it's harder for us to sort of take those frameworks into policy level. So I think that's, that balance also, that we as non-for-profits, as small grassroots organizations, that we also need to take into account how you take those successful initiatives that we're taking on, that are taking track locally, but how do you sort of take them into a more systemic level of impact in terms of policy.
And sort of taking that to that sort of next element of the work that you've done in different communities, and the community, I guess, is prevalent to talk about in terms of what you've just said is La Dignidad community in Escuintla. And firstly, it was June 2018 when the eruption happened and had a huge impact on the communities around the land, La Finca. And then there's the now displaced communities are now set up in La Dignidad. And I guess there's the short-term question of that process of being an organization, an NGO, who work in the region that is hit by this natural disaster. What was the experience of those first few weeks? And then I guess from what you just said, you've then got this community that now has been set up, and how does the work continue on that grassroots level in the community? Does the government stay involved for long after that? And how do you continue to build out that community and support them going forward? Because it's always, ever since that time, it's always amazed me how Saras has constantly had to adapt the work to fit what's actually happening in the world, and there's nothing linear about this. So I guess that short term, but then also the longer term support of the community and how that's changed Saras.
Yeah, that was, I think, a time. It was a very difficult time. I think I remember it was a Sunday afternoon, and I remember being, at my house and just starting to look at the news of the eruption, and then immediately calling Aníbal and Marco Antonio to make sure that they were okay. That was sort of our initial reaction. And then the days after the eruption, our mode was like, how can we make sure the youth that we have contact with, the communities, the leaders, that we have an immediate connection. How can we know if they're okay? So we immediately went to the shelters. They were, I have no idea how many shelters there were. There were so many, the official ones and the unofficial shelters, because people were, opening their houses for people to stay. And, it was a really small house with 30 people in there with like one bathroom. It was hard time. And during I think that first week, we were, our main work was like, how can we make sure that we identify and we know, they're located somewhere, because there were a lot of deaths and disappearances. Sadly, we did find that some of the youth didn't make it, and we couldn't be able to identify them. And of course, that was really hard for
Mm. Yeah.
yeah, for the team. And but also when you were finding someone at a shelter and making sure that they were okay, there was sort of a relief. We also started coordinating supplies and taking medical supplies to the Red Cross at the Zone Zero and supporting, because I think the shelters had a lot of things. I think there was the community in Guatemala sort of, went and supported a lot of the people. And I think the firefighters and the people that were working in those initial weeks on recovering bodies, identifying, I think they were also needing a lot of supplies to do their work. So I think we stayed on that one. And after, of course, a couple of weeks, we started to identify and sort of partner with some organizations on like how can we identify what's needed in the different shelters, because the needs were changing drastically. Sometimes they were not needing any food or clothes, but they were needing ventilators, or they were needing shelter stand like libraries to put things on, and so they can get more organized. So I think the needs were changing as the weeks went by.
And who's overseeing that? Like, because for most of us who have never been in that situation, we see the news, we hear official statements from police, we see the Red Cross are always there. In this case, I guess Conred as well, the Guatemalan body. Like, who are you going to work out how to organize this? And again, I was watching people do collections in Antigua and taking them down. How on earth do you make that into a sort of unified way that covers everybody?
I wouldn't say that it was organized. Because there were so many people trying to help out, and you have, yes, a governing body that Conrad was doing a lot of the disaster response, immediate response, and then you also have other government bodies like SOSEP managing the shelters, and the social development ministry also providing some like the food for the shelters, and doing a lot of that immediate response for like shelter. So there were a lot of governmental organizations that had specific areas of work, but you also have a lot of the community trying to support. So I think what you find was that they were creating clusters so that they could get more organized. So the bigger international NGOs were in a cluster because, of course, they had a lot of more money and support into doing larger donations. And then you had, very grassroots organizations like us and some other the ones that were more like, okay, how can we get in touch with community leaders? Like, have they, identify what are the needs? Have they identified all of the people that, they have in the community? What sort of response are they needing? So we sort of, divided a lot of the work into, networks of work, I would say. And of course, it was one of the things that we noticed is, okay, it sort of, we wanted to think that our style of leadership, of transformative leadership, of appreciative leadership was one of the styles of leaderships that you would need in an occasion like this, right? Because I think there were a lot of people that wanted to do something, but there was sort of a lack of leadership so that it could be more organized, and it could move in a way that sort of responded. Yeah, I think as time went by and, the public support sort of toned down, and then a couple of organizations stayed supporting with a clinic at the shelters. And then I think after a couple of months, probably 8 months, Um, and what I mean by the initial shelters, there were schools adapted to, just have people there. But then they started constructing these wooden shelters that people and families could live on. And those are the ones that we called atos um, in the community that were essentially, they're going to be their community after all. So once those wooden shelters were being built, then families were starting to move there, and that was also hard because it was a really small space. Squintla is very hot, and of course they changed there. They weren't going back to their house; they were going into a wooden room with 5-6 family members. So I think they spent a year living in those wooden shelters, and we stayed connected with them in terms of Saras, because we had a close connection with the community leaders, and we still wanted to, how can we sort of connect the community in itself change, because it wasn't only San Miguel Los Lotes, the community that was completely devastated, but other communities that were uncommunicated, and it said, you're at risk of going back, so you need to move. And how do you find, that neighborly sense? Because you're not, you weren't my neighbor, so why do I need to be nice to you? Or why? So there were a lot of difficulties in terms of how they were managing conflicts, and we had to change the vision for the Finca in itself, because it was closer to the communities of they were working, and we were like, how can we use this space to still support the communities, the leaders that were affected, and also how can we work with the community that was displaced, in terms of how can we help them create community. And it's really hard to use that word when you don't feel like, and what we did is initially we just ask, what's community for you? Do you feel that La Dignidad is your community now? What's lacking? And from then on, we started facilitating spaces for youth to meet. It was really hard, and one of the things that interests them was oh, I want to meet someone from the other, Las Palmas, or I want to meet someone from the other side. And that was what it makes, it made them, start to get closer.
So how many communities are now living in La Dignidad? Or how many communities were displaced in that process?
Initially there were, I think 3 communities, and then they added 2 more. There is still 1 community living in the shelters, in the wooden shelters, the atos, because they are trying to get other side of, another land for them to be located. But there are 5 communities overall now living in La Dignidad. And from different parts of the skirts of the volcano.
Something that came up, exactly what you just said there, and often comes up in conversations anytime, particularly with volcanic eruptions, this happens, and you hear conversations in the media, but also conversations that I've had where people ask, why is it in such a, Fuego is one of the most active volcanoes in the entire world. Why would people live in that area on the slopes of Fuego? And I guess there's a fairly complex answer to it, and probably some simple elements to that answer as well. But it's a question that I think everyone who doesn't live in Guatemala or in a volcanic country is baffled by, really.
It's a complex one, because I think that Guatemala has 33 volcanoes, and we only have 3 active volcanoes. But even in those 3 active volcanoes, you always gonna see people living in the skirts. So it's not just Fuego, right? It's also Pacaya and Santiaguito. And I think there's a lack of laws for land tenure. So people owning land, it's difficult, especially, if you don't have income, or you're, a low income family. So, you'll settle where there's land available. And sometimes that's at the skirts of an active volcano. And other times, like the volcano of Fuego, some of the communities were actually resettled by the government. So that's, for me, baffling. Because the Guatemala government at some point, I think it's during the 80s or sometime before, um, they own those lands, and they sort of settle some of the people that were affected by the internal conflict that we had during the 80s, throughout 36 years, into those lands. So I think that's also a government decision on, where do you locate some of the people. And I think people, we are a very vulnerable country, and I think we are just, I think we normalize that we are so vulnerable, so that everything that we are, we're choosing not. We know that something might happen, and we don't see some of the risk and assess. And so I think it's a lot of things that made a lot of these people sort of decided, this is where we're gonna settle in any community. And some of them lived there for years and generations. They grew up there, and that's where they feel like it's home. And they don't know anywhere else. So I think that the sense of risk is sometimes not always there for us, because we're so used to being vulnerable.
And do you live in Guatemala City? You can see both Pacaya and Fuego from the city when it's clear. How do you feel about that? I mean, when you live in the city, I don't think you feel the intimacy of the volcano in that same way. But what's your opinion of living in a country and living in a place so vulnerable to that kind of, to something like an eruption?
I think people living in the city is like, oh, it's beautiful, like the Pacaya is erupting, And then if I didn't have that immediate connection to the communities living there and knowing, the risk, I would say, it's a nice scenery, and, you really get very beautiful sunsets. But knowing the realities, and knowing, what's behind and what's going, every time there's an eruption, of course, I immediately get alarmed. And it's not only eruptions. Now it's when you have heavy rainfall. So the lahares are, bringing a lot of dirt and rocks and rain through the communities. So that's also a worry. So it's not only having an eruption, that's gonna cause harm, but it's also a heavy rainfall that's gonna potentially, impact. So I think now I'm more aware of
conscious. I mean, I think flying, when I first arrived in Guatemala, I will confess to being one of the people who knew very little, if anything, about the country. I'd met some people who thought that it'd be a great place to put on an impact marathon, and they were right, but I had no idea when I flew in. I honestly didn't have a clue that I would go up at the top of my building and see a volcano erupt, or at least release gas in the evenings, and it's so constant in both Pacaya and Fuego that it does. I mean, it becomes normal. Having lived there for 6 months or so now, it's become very normal part of it, and it's something that we actively say is an amazing thing to come and see. But there are real risks to that, and I think the other thing that I wasn't really aware of coming into the country was the history of Guatemala. And you mentioned there the 36 years of internal conflict. And previously, I was actually on that trip. I'd spent time in Colombia, and I'd spent time there and learning about the ongoing impact of 50 years of war in Colombia. I was wondering, if you could talk about that element of the ongoing, if there is ongoing conversations, if there is an ongoing just social normalities that stem from the impact of 36 years of internal conflict.
Yeah, I think conversations are still going, and because recently, I can't remember if it was like 2 or 3 years ago, maybe, there was a big case trying to prosecute Rios Montt, the general, and at the time leading for genocide. And I think that when you get to one of those high level cases, of course, it brings back conversations about the conflict. And one of the things that we still see in some of the communities, especially because we work in Uspantan, Quiche, and Uspantan is near the Ishio region, which was very devastated by the civil war, by the internal conflict. So there, you can still see the inequalities that were left. For us is, the leaders that at the time, were sort of speaking out and raising their voices were disappeared, were killed. And of course it leaves communities, when we were talking that, silence is the best bet, because most of the youth that grew after the internal conflict, right after, the 80s, right? The end of the 80s, beginning of 90s, their parents just taught them, don't speak, don't raise your voice, don't talk, because that's how we survived. That's how, we made it this far. And so you still see that. You see that in the communities, younger people are often, more timid to speak, probably won't raise their voices. And I think that's something that we internalize. That's you see that a lot of indigenous communities internalizing resentment, I think, at some point. And even though, that's not something visible, that's not something that you can put in statistics, we see that a lot in the work that we do, and how it needs to be healed. And I think that's a very personal story that, every people needs to, go through it. But of course, I think we can still see a lot of that impact mainly in indigenous communities that were deeply affected by the conflict.
I spent some time on the last couple of years. I've gone up to Huehue, excuse my pronunciation as always, but Huehue, Tenango, and Shayla, the second city, and doing speeches and boot camps with social entrepreneurs. And something that everyone warned me about was, when you do the speech, don't expect loads of questions. Don't expect lots of. It will take time for the group to warm up, and it always did happen. But it's absolutely true, and I guess that I think it's really good time to talk about the main pillar of the Saras work, which is the leadership programs. And I think once the context that you've just given there is such a powerful conversation. When we've brought impact runners to Saras projects, whether that's Floor in Tecpan or La Dignidad, something that we've tried to kind of give is that context of what you're seeing of youth having a voice. This isn't the same here in Guatemala. That's actually a massive step, in the context you just giving is a brilliant part of that. What are the leadership programs all about? What is it that it comes back to why you joined Saras as well in this respect, in terms of the importance of that. Why is it that you've honed in on leadership, I guess, is the first question. And the next question is, and how have you gone into to do that and to develop young leaders and their voices?
Yeah, I think for us is, for the changes that we need, I think, as a world, as a region, we need leaders, right? And I think for us was, how can we support and build a generation, like a leaderful generation? And youth were sort of right there in our faces. Like, I think the youth are the largest generation in history right now, and 90% of those are living in developing countries. So Guatemala, El Salvador, and our region, I think more than 60% of our population is under 30 years old. Of course, that includes children, but it's just massive large of people that we have right, at our doorstep that could create change. And we saw them, as an opportunity, to sort of, how can they be the ones leading some of the most needed changes? And the leadership programs are focused on how can we support these young people to develop leadership skills for the 21st century. And by this, I mean, like, how can they learn about sustainable development? How can they start thinking about systemic change? How can they, use critical thinking or learn about critical thinking, ask good questions. And a lot of the things are usually hardly taught at school, very traditional in during our educational public system. There's not a lot of those things that you get taught. So our leadership training programs are focused on developing those skills that are going to be useful not only for their own life or their professional lives, but also how can they create impact and be agents of change. And so the programs start by us, providing them with a lot of tools and frameworks on identifying global issues and how are they connected into the local level, like climate change, like that. Even in an indigenous language, it doesn't exist. So how can you, or the term sustainability, for example, and so how can you use some of those global contexts and global challenges into those local levels, and how can you translate them, and how can they understand them, and then how can they create a vision of their community. So the leadership programs also provide that sense of belonging, so that they are more connected to their roots, to their communities, to their towns, to who they are, and so to create that vision of what they would look like, and how can they bridge that gap between what they have now and what they would like their community to be, and what are those immediate steps that they can take. So the leadership for us is not only on, I'm a leader, but it's leadership in action. So exercising that citizen muscle for us is, and for that we mean, okay, how can you be active? How can you start getting more involved? And we do that by supporting small community action plans or community initiatives led by youth and led by the community, by start creating small changes so that their communities are more resilient overall. And then it's connecting them with a network. So it's not just one leader in one of the regions that we work with, they are connected with a lot of other young leaders in both countries, in Guatemala and El Salvador, in the different regions of those countries, to see that they're not alone in creating and wanting to do change. And the challenges might be different, the challenges might be the same, and they might, they could use support and exchange those experiences among themselves. So creating a very diverse network. So that's sort of the focus and sort of what encompasses the trainings. It's a 3-series program, so it's three different programs. It's a process where they go through in order for them to be alumni or ambassadors, like we like to call them. And once they are ambassadors, they are in a more active in a position of leadership in their communities, and they are already harnessing, the leaders of others to create change. So that's a bit of what the leadership trainings are.
And so when you think of the vision you have for the future of some of the youth that you already have in the schemes, and the future youth that will come and be involved in the programs, is it that you want them to be political leaders? Where does that leadership take them? What is your vision for that?
Yes, and I think what we want for them is for them to find their own developmental pathway. That's sort of what we want to call them. We do have young people that in our last elections last year were running for congressman, in the list for him. So
Wow.
pretty interesting to see that they are wanting to get more involved in politics and wanting to get more involved in those sort of spaces. But we also, the idea of how can we create more local businesses led by leaders that are more conscious, for example. So we don't see them all in the political sphere, but we also see them as entrepreneurs. And we see them as activists, which is a very different thing, right? They're fighting for the different rights that they see that they're important, and then they're pushing forward. We see them people creating movements. So we don't necessarily see all of them in political positions. Some of them have those aspirations, and we root for them and we want them. That's the way, and then where they have seen that's where I'm going to create change. And some others are saying I'm going to create change by being a local entrepreneur, like Flor, for example. And she's not. I think it's how they see those opportunities opening up, and then starting to get involved in those spaces. Flor was a very shy girl when I met her, and now she has her own farm with her family. She's more active in the community as a female leader. She's being heard at the community meetings, and her opinions are taken into account. So who knows, maybe in the future she might be saying, okay, I'm representing the women in my community, or I'm creating a women commission for my community. And that's local leadership. Getting involved in those small decision-making spaces. So yes, and we don't all see them in the political sphere.
I mean, it's because when you think leaders, often things come to mind as business leaders, usually captains in sports. You look at the leaders on the football pitch or whichever, and then you also have politics as those are the three areas that I think comes to mind when people think of leaders. And but then we saw recently in the American election, and you see, yes, you've got two leaders up there in terms of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But then if you look at the state of Georgia, you've got Stacey Abrams and the work that she did, encouraging African Americans across that state to sign up, to register, to vote, and the impact that she's had on that state's election. Forget all of the other stuff that's going on. We don't know when this is going to be December by the time this goes out, so who knows, but this has taken a snapshot in time in the middle of November. But the role that a leader, we're not talking about a president here, we're talking about a community activist who has managed to engage people in politics in a way. And I think that there's a lot that about grassroots leadership that often gets overlooked when we always talk about the great leaders and that those might, but every single person has that role to play in being a leader. What are the main challenges you come across when you're starting to work with youth as they come into the program? I mean, how do you find even the youth to come and join the program? How does that process work? And then what is that first day like in terms of connecting them? What is the impression of leadership for young Guatemalans when potentially, if they look up to role models in leadership, it's not always there within the political sphere in Guatemala at the moment?
Yeah. So how we invite them to be part of the leadership training programs, we have different strategies, and it depends on which community we're working with. But we usually, if there are or have been ambassadors already going through some of the programs, they become references of Saras. So they would probably say, I have some people, I have some young leaders that are already organized that I would love to be part of. I talked about the program, I've engaged them. They're sort of, excited to be part of. In other communities, we do partner with schools so that we can get, an opening and also match some of their curriculum into some of the leadership training, so they're more open to, letting their students participate, because most of our programs are 3 days training to 7 days residential trainings, and now we have switched since August to a more virtual setting, dividing the programs into 7 smaller modules. So we're of course adjusting and adapting, and now it's social media, right? So for the virtual settings, we have our community Facebook pages so that it goes through the specific communities where we work with, and also through the already created networks that we have. So that's sort of how we spread the word. In El Salvador, for example, we have a partnership with a municipality. So we're working with the youth unit within the municipality, and they have said, okay, we're excited. We want to do a couple of programs with you as part of like the youth development unit. So we have found sort of a stronger partnership to sort of carry on. So it varies a lot depending on, what are the partnerships and how the community organizes that we have to, and we also partner with other organizations, NGOs that are working in the same geographical areas that they want to complement some of the work that they're doing with some of like the leadership work that we could support and provide.
And then that first day comes around, and I imagine the youth are often a bit nervous or not quite sure what to expect next. And I imagine I don't know how it turns up. It always feels to me like anytime I go to these sorts of trainings myself, it feels like I'm back at school and I've got to start talking to people. How do you open that up, and then how do you start to sort of really get deep and tackle those bigger challenges, such as that sort of inherent what you said earlier, that quietness, that not wanting to stand out, not wanting to have a voice, and potentially not knowing where that historically comes from. You've attributed it maybe potentially to the Civil War, but a 13-year-old doesn't make that connection between oh, don't speak up, to oh, this is why.
We also use, and I forgot to mention it, but we also use our youth hubs at our community centers that we've started as well, also to promote and be a space, for people to know, we have these services and programs available. The first day, for the first program, we have tried to facilitate it in a way that it's a very experiential learning. So it's not, a workshop sort of style of training. It's more of a very active learning. And we also use a lot of the facilitation in the case that, it's in-person training. The facilitation is based on creating community and trust. So we will start with a quick check-in at the beginning for people to start to introduce. Then we're going to start introducing a lot of like play for peace dynamics, so that, we're starting to get them connected, not necessarily going into some of those issues. And then when we're starting, the first part is we divide our program in 4 parts. So it's focus, vision, change, and action. So those are the 4 parts that we divide all of our programs. And the first day, it's all based on focus. And by focus means like researching what are the issues, talking about issues, sort of analyzing, and we use different dynamics like social media. So we, have everyone on their phones looking into Twitter for specific hashtags and what other stories that are coming up. And then they're sharing, what did you find, instead of actually, making opinions right away. So a lot of the work that we do is, how can we make connections with, what they know, and then for them to start sharing instead of, just asking questions right away. And, start interacting not only with their peers at the same training, but, they get to do surveys with people from the community. So they will go out and, have a list of questions, and can you go out to the, man that, serves the school shop so that you can ask some questions, and the lady that sells fruit, can you ask them about these specific questions, and questions about the economy, the politics, the culture. So they'll come back with, oh, I didn't know my community thought this way. So yeah, of course, at the beginning it's a bit quiet. The first couple of hours are very quiet. At the end of the day, it's a completely different setting. They're all talking to each other and saying, I want to come back to the next day. And that's also what we're trying to do virtually. Difficult, but the team of facilitators have found really interesting technological tools that offer some of those interactive ways of communicating.
And so within all of this, it's now 2 years, almost 2 years now, since you became a leader of Saras yourself, alongside Abby, who's a force of nature. We've got 2 co-exec directors who are leading Saras, who are both women. And how common is that in Guatemala, I guess, is the first question. And then how have you found that? Have you felt, how have you found that? Let's just stick with that as a simple question.
I don't know if it's that simple. When we accepted the challenge, to lead, I think one of the things I said to Abby was, I couldn't find a better person to be doing this with you, because we're a team, right? It's not, I'm trying to push on this topic and she's trying to push on the other. And, there's this challenge of power that you often see. And I think we've heard stories about co-directorships in other organizations that haven't worked. And for us, it's a lot in, I think we mentor each other. If I don't know something, I'll go and say, Abby, what's this about? Can you tell me, I'm having this difficulty. And I think we have the trust to do that with one another. Of course, it has been also a challenge that with our co-directorship change and transition, we've also gone into trying to be a teal organization. So adapting also to a different organizational model, has been a lot of learnings, but has also made opportunities for us to change and lead in a very different way, instead of being what we call like the boss, right? We're more mentors to the rest of the team, instead of and coaches, for example, instead of leading and taking decisions on our own. I have found that Abby's always there to when I have a difficulty in any of the areas, and I think we complement each other. I have because of my background, the stronger skills in finance and administration and organizational. And then Abby's really creative, and she's always thinking about how can we innovate this, and how can we create this, and she's really connected also with the network, as she was an alumni of Saras, and she was part of the programs. She has a really strong sense of connection with the network, and just having that from complementing each other is really good. And she mentioned it once when we were talking, it's often because of our background as a country, her being indigenous, I am from the city, you often don't sort of get along really well in a lot of the settings. And for us, it's like, how can we harness our differences to create a powerful team together? And also, what are the things that, we're both Guatemalan women, young women, so what are our commonalities? So, having those discussions with her and just going through that together has been a really interesting experience. There are areas that we don't have, or we didn't have any experience at all, and we just had to learn through the way, and with the support, of course, of a larger network, of the board, of some of our mentors. But yeah, and I think I could say I'm really proud of what we accomplished in those last couple of years, and I know that's more coming. And we're already thinking about what will be a successful transition from our side. How are we thinking? So we're always thinking of opening opportunities for others, and not just saying we're gonna stick here forever. So if this is a 5-year thing that we're looking into the future, how are we preparing others also to step on into these positions? So our conversations are very interesting, I would say.
And do you find that as women that's affected you in any way in terms of your leadership styles, but also in terms of how others view you, both inside Guatemala, but also I guess internationally? Much of the Saras fundraising happens abroad. Do you find that that it's a strength to what you're doing, or do you find that you come up against challenges?
Yeah, I think there are definitely challenges. Not having a larger network in the US or in the areas where we fundraise, of course, it limits our capacity to sort of reach out and connect. I think that's a constant question that we sort of share when we have conversations with foundations. We always get introductions by people that are foreigners living in Guatemala, or that they have connections abroad instead of being local with connections. And so yeah, I think that's a challenge. And I think we are finding our power, I will say, because I think Abigail has her own power, being an indigenous woman. She's leading, and also myself. So I think trying to find that power, and how can we sort of use that, not only for Saras, but how can we sort of power that through the challenges that we have. There are more opportunities opening up for women, I think, in our sphere, and I think that is something that, of course, we're trying to see as an open door, as an invitation for us to knock in and come. But we do had a difficult conversation with I think one of our donors at some point, because we were young women, and that connection was done with the founder, and it's also a woman, but foreigner. So I think just pushing through that initial conversation of the doubts that potentially some other people see in us, and then I think it was just in a matter of time of showing what, we have the capacity, we can do that. And of course now he's a really committed donor. He's still supporting us, and he's still backing the work. And it's not just it's backing Saras, but I think it's also backing ourselves, Abigail and myself. So yeah.
So final couple of things to cover as we come into land, I guess. Two more, well, I guess not simple questions at all, but in terms of, if you had one thing that you could have that would change, to catalyze the change you're looking to see, you've got one wish. It could be policy related, it could be funded, it could be whatever you want it to be. What would be the one change that could happen in the world that would catalyze your program and your vision?
That's not an easy question. I think personally, one of the things that I have been, I think, in the back of my mind, has been this: how can we, as a movement of leaders that, it's more than 5,000 leaders have gone through some of the leadership programs, of course, we have around 100 that are very active as ambassadors, but how can that movement start to, form coalitions with others? So that we can sort of harness that local leadership, that local knowledge, what have worked into, pushing, moving sort of like the needle in some of those spaces and some of the issues that we are having in the region and in both of our countries. So yeah, I'm sort of finding ways of, if coalitions with other movements can sort of shift that, what would that look like? That's in the back of my mind, possibly a potential opportunity. And I think it's, how can, some of the initiatives become sustainable, and not only by funding, but how can community sort of, takes them on as their own. And I think one of the things that we have in mind is the community centers and the Finca as those spaces for the community to sort of use them, to have the services, the tools, and sort of shift that organizational support versus community driven. I think that would be something that I would be looking for in the future.
Cool. And final question, and this is the one question that every single person gets asked, and it's, I think, a particularly pertinent one for this year. It's been a crazy year. I don't want to say a bad year, or I don't even want to say a difficult year. It's just been a really different and intriguing year for all of us. But it's a great question for you in particular, because having, visited with Saras now for 4 years, I'm always amazed at how, despite challenges, it never feels like you're trying to paint a bad picture of the work you do, or there's never that side of things. It's always a very optimistic, empowering, and forward-looking organization. So I feel like this is actually the easiest question of the day, which is, what in all of this, in difficult times when it comes to global leadership, in difficult times when it comes to climate change, and obviously the pandemic, what is it that makes you optimistic? What are the things that make you optimistic about the future, both for yourself but also for future generations?
For me, it's, we are betting on long-term change, right? And sometimes it's harder to see that immediately after a program, after a year. And I think after 11 years of working during this pandemic and COVID and lockdowns and restrictions, what gave me hope and what, sort of pushed me through was looking at some of the young leaders, saying, what, the home garden that I started a year ago, 2 years ago, now, that's what's supporting me and my family. Some of the things that I started 2, 3 years ago, now it's making very useful. How they got involved with a lot of the community organizing and making sure the spread, was kept into a minimum at some point. For me, it was just those stories that sort of kept me saying, what, change and social change doesn't happen, a day, one day after another. So investing in the long term, it's sort of what keeps me moving. That, probably 10 years from now, 2030, we're all talking about what's 2030 going to look like. I think, we're gonna have a generation of Guatemalans and Salvadorians with a vision and potentially, making change. Hopefully not too late for our time, because we are, having struggles and going through harder times. And I think Guatemala and El Salvador, we had COVID, we have our tropical storms this year, and we don't know what's coming. And I think people are still resilient, and people are, finding ways to respond. And my hope and my optimism is to see those visions and to see those ideas of change pushing forward, and having more sustainable communities.
Brilliant. Well, we haven't even discussed the work in El Salvador and the history of El Salvador. That's, I guess, for another day. But thank you for obviously taking the time to talk today, but also for all of the work that you do, for always inspiring and challenging me personally. And I'm just really grateful to have you in my life, and also to have had this chance to. We've gone on quite a long time now to chat to you today. So Sarah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Nick.